Home to the cradle of civilization, the Middle East has seen many of the world's oldest cultures and civilizations. This history started from the earliest human settlements, continuing through several major pre- and post-Islamic empires through to the modern collection of nation-states covering the Middle East today. Egyptian civilization coalesced around 3150 BC with the political unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaoh. Mesopotamia was home to several powerful empires that came to rule almost the entire Middle East, particularly the Assyrian Empires of 1365 to 1076 BC, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire of 911–605 BC. From the early 7th century BC and onwards, the Iranian Medes followed by Achaemenid Persia and other subsequent Iranian states empires dominated the region. In the 1st century BC, the expanding Roman Republic absorbed the whole eastern Mediterranean, which included much of the Near East. The Eastern Roman Empire, today commonly known as the Byzantine Empire, ruling from the Balkans to the Euphrates, became increasingly defined by and dogmatic about Christianity, gradually creating religious rifts between the doctrines dictated by the establishment in Constantinople, and believers in many parts of the Middle East. From the 3rd up to the course of the 7th century AD, the entire Middle East was dominated by the Byzantines and Sassanid Persia. From the 7th century, a new power was rising in the Middle East, that of Islam. The dominance of the Arabs came to a sudden end in the mid-11th century with the arrival of the Seljuk Turks. In the early 13th century, a new wave of invaders, the armies of the Mongol Empire, mainly Turkic, swept through the region. By the early 15th century, a new power had arisen in western Anatolia, the Ottoman emirs, linguistically Turkic and religiously Islamic, who in 1453 captured the Christian Byzantine capital of Constantinople and made themselves sultans. Large parts of the Middle East became a war ground between the Ottomans and Iranian Safavids for centuries, starting in the early 16th century. By 1700, the Ottomans had been driven out of Hungary and the balance of power along the frontier had shifted decisively in favor of the West. The British also established effective control of the Persian Gulf, and the French extended their influence into Lebanon and Syria. In 1912, the Italians seized Libya and the Dodecanese Islands, just off the coast of the Ottoman heartland of Anatolia. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Middle Eastern rulers tried to modernize their states to compete more effectively with the European powers. A turning point in the history of the Middle East came when oil was discovered, first in Persia in 1908 and later in Saudi Arabia and the other Persian Gulf states, and also in Libya and Algeria. A Western dependence on Middle Eastern oil and the decline of British influence led to a growing American interest in the region. During the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, Syria and Egypt made moves towards independence. The British, the French, and the Soviets departed from many parts of the Middle East during and after World War II. The struggle between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine culminated in the 1947 United Nations plan to partition Palestine. Later, in the midst of Cold War tensions, the Arabic-speaking countries of Western Asia and Northern Africa saw the rise of Pan-Arabism, the departure of the European powers from direct control of the region, the establishment of Israel, and the increasing importance of the oil industry, marked the creation of the modern Middle East. In most Middle Eastern countries, the growth of market economies was inhibited by political restrictions, corruption and cronyism, overspending on arms and prestige projects, and overdependence on oil revenues. The wealthiest economies in the region per capita are the small oil-rich countries of the Gulf, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and similar changes in other Muslim-majority countries throughout the 1980s, The region has been experiencing an ideological trend in favor of Islamism. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought a global security refocus from a Cold War to a war on terror. Starting in late 2010s, a revolutionary wave popularly known as the Arab Spring brought major protests, uprisings, and even revolutions to several Middle Eastern and Maghreb countries. Clashes in western Iraq on 30 December 2013 were preliminary to the Sunni pan-Islamist ISIL uprising. The term Near East can be used interchangeably with Middle East, but in a different context, especially when discussing ancient times. It may have a limited meaning, namely the northern, historically Aramaic-speaking Semitic area and adjacent Anatolian territories, marked in the two maps below. General. Geographically, the Middle East can be thought of as Western Asia without the Caucasus, but with Egypt, which is the non-Maghreb part of northern Africa. The Middle East was the first to experience a Neolithic revolution, as well as the first to enter the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Historically, human populations have tended to settle around bodies of water, which is reflected in modern population density patterns. Irrigation systems were extremely important for the agricultural Middle East. For Egypt that of the Lower Nile River, and for Mesopotamia that of the Tigris River and Euphrates River. Levantine agriculture depended on precipitation rather than on the river-based irrigation of Egypt and Mesopotamia, resulting in preference for different crops. Since travel was faster and easier by sea, civilizations along the Mediterranean, such as Phoenicia and later Greece, participated in intense trade. Similarly, ancient Yemen, much more conducive to agriculture than the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, traded heavily with the Horn of Africa, some of which lingually Semitized. The Adnanite Arabs, inhabiting the drier desert areas of the Middle East, were all nomadic pastoralists before some began settling in city-states, with the geolinguistic distribution today being divided between the Gulf, the Najd and the Hejaz in the peninsula, as well as the Bedouin areas beyond the peninsula. Since ancient times the Middle East has had several lingua francae, Akkadian, Aramaic, Greek, and Arabic. Familiarity with English is not uncommon among the middle and upper classes. Arabic is not commonly spoken in Turkey, Iran, and Israel, and some varieties of Arabic lack mutual intelligibility, thus qualifying as distinct languages by this linguistic criterion. The Middle East was the birthplace of the Abrahamic, Gnostic, and most Iranian religions. Initially the ancient inhabitants of the region followed various ethnic religions, but most of those began to be gradually replaced at first by Christianity and finally by Islam. To this day, however, the Middle East has, in particular, some sizable, ethnically distinct Christian minority groups, as well as Jews, concentrated in Israel, and followers of Iranian religions, such as Yazdanism and Zoroastrianism. Some of the smaller ethno-religious minorities include the Shabak people, the Mandeans and the Samaritans. It is somewhat controversial whether the Druze religion is a distinct religion in its own right or merely a part of the Ismailist branch of Shia Islam. Prehistory. The Arabian tectonic plate was part of the African plate during much of the Phanerozoic Eon, until the Oligocene epoch of the Cenozoic era. Red Sea rifting began in the Eocene, but the separation of Africa and Arabia occurred in the Oligocene, and since then the Arabian plate has been slowly moving toward the Eurasian plate. The collision between the Arabian plate and Eurasia is pushing up the Zagros Mountains of Iran. Because the Arabian plate and Eurasia plate collide, many cities are in danger, such as those in southeastern Turkey. These dangers include earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes. The earliest human migrations out of Africa occurred through the Middle East, namely over the Levantine corridor, with the pre-modern Homo erectus about 1.8 million years BP. One of the potential routes for early human migrations towards southern and eastern Asia is Iran. Haplogroup JP209, the most common human Y chromosome DNA haplogroup in the Middle East today, is believed to have arisen in the region 31,700 plus or minus 12,800 years ago. The two main current subgroups, JM267 and JM172, which now comprise between them almost all of the population of the haplogroup, are both believed to have arisen very early, at least 10,000 years ago. Nonetheless, Y chromosomes FM89** and IJM429** were reported to have been observed in the Iranian plateau. There is evidence of rock carvings along the Nile terraces and in desert oases. In the 10th millennium BC, a culture of hunter-gatherers and fishermen was replaced by a grain-grinding culture. Climate changes and or overgrazing around 6000 BC began to desiccate the pastoral lands of Egypt, forming the Sahara. Early tribal peoples migrated to the Nile River, where they developed a settled agricultural economy and more centralized society. The Ancient Near East. The Ancient Near East was the first to practice intensive year-round agriculture and currency-mediated trade, gave the rest of the world the first writing system, invented the potter's wheel and then the vehicular and mill wheel, created the first centralized governments and law codes, served as birthplace to the first city-states with their high degree of division of labor, as well as laying the foundation for the fields of astronomy and mathematics. However, its empires also introduced rigid social stratification, slavery, and organized warfare. Cradle of civilization. Sumer and Akkad, the earliest civilizations in history, were established in the region now known as the Middle East around 3500 BC by the Sumerians. In Mesopotamia, widely regarded as the cradle of civilization, the Sumerians and the Akkadians all flourished in this region. In the course of the 4th millennium BC, city-states developed in southern Mesopotamia that were dominated by temples whose priests represented the city's patron deities. The most prominent of the city-states was Sumer, which gave its language to the area, presumably the first written language, and became the first great civilization of mankind. About 2340 BC, Sargon the Great united the city-states in the south and founded the Akkadian dynasty, the world's first empire, Egypt. Soon after the Sumerian civilization began, the Nile Valley of Lower and Upper Egypt was unified under the pharaohs approximately around 3150 BC. Since then, ancient Egypt experienced three high points of civilization, the so-called kingdom periods: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom and, most notably, the New Kingdom. The history of ancient Egypt is concluded by the Late Period, immediately followed by the history of Egypt in classical antiquity, beginning with Ptolemaic Egypt, the Levant and Anatolia thereafter. Civilization quickly spread through the Fertile Crescent to the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea and throughout the Levant, as well as to ancient Anatolia. Ancient Levantine kingdoms and city-states included Ebla city, Ugrit city, Kingdom of Aram Damascus, Kingdom of Israel, Kingdom of Judah, Kingdom of Ammon, Kingdom of Moab, Kingdom of Edom, and the Nabatean Kingdom. The Phoenician Civilization, encompassing several city-states, was a maritime trading culture that established colonial cities in the Mediterranean basin, most notably Carthage, in 814 BC. Assyrian Empires. Mesopotamia was home to several powerful empires that came to rule almost the entire Middle East, particularly the Assyrian Empires, 1365 to 1076 BC, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire of 911–605 BC. The Assyrian Empire, at its peak, was the largest the world had seen. It ruled all of what is now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Kuwait, Jordan, Egypt, Cyprus, and Bahrain, with large swathes of Iran, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Sudan, and Arabia. The Assyrian empires, particularly the third, had a profound and lasting impact on the Near East. Before Assyrian hegemony ended, the Assyrians brought the highest civilization to the then-known world, from the Caspian to Cyprus, from Anatolia to Egypt. Assyrian imperial expansion would bring into the Assyrian sphere nomadic and barbaric communities, and would bestow the gift of civilization upon them. Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires from the early 6th century BC onwards. Several Persian states dominated the region, beginning with the Medes and non-Persian Neo-Babylonian Empire. Then their successor, the Achaemenid Empire, known as the First Persian Empire, conquered in the late 4th century BC by the very short-lived Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, and then successor kingdoms such as Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid state in Western Asia. After a century of hiatus, the idea of the Persian Empire was revived by the Central Asian Iranian Parthians in the 3rd century BC, and continued by their successors, the Sassanids from the 3rd century AD. This empire dominated sizable parts of what is now the Asian part of the Middle East and continued to influence the rest of the Asiatic and African, Middle East region, until the Arab-Muslim conquest of Persia in the mid-7th century CE. Between the 1st century BC and the early 7th century AD, the region was completely dominated by the Romans and the Parthians and Sassanids on the other hand, which often culminated in various Roman-Persian wars over the 7 centuries. Eastern Rite Church of the East Christianity took hold in Persian-ruled Mesopotamia, particularly in Assyria from the 1st century AD onwards, and the region became a center of a flourishing Syriac-Assyrian literary tradition. Greek and Roman Empire in the 1st century BC, the expanding Roman Republic absorbed the whole eastern Mediterranean, which included much of the Near East. The Roman Empire united the region with most of Europe and North Africa in a single political and economic unit. Even areas not directly annexed were strongly influenced by the empire, which was the most powerful political and cultural entity for centuries. Though Roman culture spread across the region, the Greek culture and language first established in the region by the Macedonian Empire continued to dominate throughout the Roman period. Cities in the Middle East, especially Alexandria, became major urban centers for the empire, and the region became the empire's breadbasket. As the key agricultural producer, Egypt was by far the most wealthy Roman province. As the Christian religion spread throughout the Roman and Persian empires, it took root in the Middle East, and cities such as Alexandria and Edessa became important centers of Christian scholarship. By the 5th century, Christianity was the dominant religion in the Middle East, with other faiths being actively repressed. The Middle East's ties to the city of Rome were gradually severed as the empire split into East and West, with the Middle East tied to the new Roman capital of Constantinople. The subsequent fall of the Western Roman Empire therefore had minimal direct impact on the region. Byzantine Empire The Eastern Roman Empire, today commonly known as the Byzantine Empire, ruling from the Balkans to the Euphrates, became increasingly defined by and dogmatic about Christianity, gradually creating religious rifts between the doctrines dictated by the establishment in Constantinople, and believers in many parts of the Middle East. By this time, Greek had become the lingua franca of the region, although ethnicities such as the Syriacs and the Hebrew continued to exist. Under Byzantine Greek rule, the area of the Levant met an era of stability and prosperity.